Well, I'm coming to you today with another unfortunate story of kids in Washington State in the care of the Department of Social and Health Services at the time. It's now foster care now under the Department of Children, Youth, and Families, which was in part created because of the number of problems with DSHS. And unfortunately, we have a case of three children who were placed in a foster home after having been removed from an abusive situation, only to be put into another situation where they were abused. And I'm joined by attorney Daryl Cochran with the Fow Cochran firm, who's on this case. Daryl, thank you for joining me. Let me start by asking you just to tell us a little bit about, what happened with these kids. Tell us their story.
So these were children over in the Moses Lake area who were with parents in a fractured home. The mom did her best to try to take care of them. Ultimately, DSHS felt it was important to remove them from her care and put them into the biological father's care, which unfortunately the biological father was a horribly abusive, including sexually abusive father. And when that came to light, DSHS removed them from the biological father. And this is the point at which you would expect DSHS 1 to be providing sexual abuse care and therapy to these kids and making sure that they finally got an opportunity to be in a home that was safe and stable and nurturing. And instead, what do we find them doing? They put them into an ill-equipped foster home, which already had a sexually abusive foster child in it who was about 10 years older than these kids. And the result, predictably, was that this sexually offending foster care boy then sexually assaulted all of these young children.
That again, I keep using the word unfortunate because the state Supreme Court has said over and over that when children are in the care of the state, it is the state's responsibility to make sure they are in an environment, primarily, firstly, where they are safe and, of course, being well cared for. And, having worked in foster care myself many years ago, I can tell you, when making a placement like that, a social worker that has even the slightest hint of knowing what they're doing would never place them into a home where there's that kind of situation. Once
That's
they were there, what does DHS have to say about making this placement, knowing in hindsight that it was a bad idea?
well, the response was, well, if we would have communicated better and known that this older foster boy was sexually abusive, that we would have stuck him in there. But of course, they had every reason to know it at the time. And you correctly point out that the Supreme Court's told us this over and over again, but both the legislature and the governor's office have also said over and over again, make child safety a priority. And the legislature's equipped DSHS with all of these statutory and administrative powers to make sure that they're putting kids only in, say, foster homes, and yet it ultimately comes down to who are you hiring to be caseworkers, and do they really care about prioritizing child safety?
Yeah, I mean it's just unreal to think about it. Now, I noted in what was sent to us that their social worker eventually admitted that had they known of this situation, they wouldn't have placed them there. What does that say to you when you've got a social worker who is placing children and not even fully aware of the situation they're placing them into?
Two things. One, that caseworker didn't do what they were supposed to have done, which is go on site, ask the questions that need to be asked, figure out really whether that home is going to be a safe, nurturing home. And then you have to have communication, which might be, landing on the desk of a supervisor to make sure that the left hand knows what the right hand's doing. And one of the tragedies on this is that the older foster care boy who is the sexual offender, I mean, he's a child that had to be pulled out of his home because he was getting sexually abused there. And I know the DSHS never provided the type of counseling and therapy that would have created the barriers for him sexually abusing. So there are a lot of victims in this tragedy.
Indeed. The other thing I keep thinking about, if the social worker wasn't making the proper visits, if they didn't know what was going on, do we know if this is a case of them being overloaded with too many cases to keep up with? Because I feel like that's been a common theme over the years.
It certainly was in the 1990s, where we saw caseworkers with upwards of 150 or 200 case files that they had to work on, and they just said, "Oh my gosh, we are overwhelmed." DSHS has made strides in the caseloads, and ultimately you've got to have strong supervisors there making sure that if there's an overload, that they step in and get help, or if they just have a caseworker who's not spending the time to make sure things are safe, that they do that.
So tell me a little about the suit. What are we asking for? Well, there's been a settlement here. So tell me about the settlement.
So the lawsuit was about 2.5 years in progress, and we were at the point of trying the case in front of a jury in Thurston County a couple days before, or a couple days after the point at which it settled. So 2 days prior to trial, this case settles for $9.35 million, which roughly was about equal between all of the kids. And it certainly shouldn't have lasted that long, but for whatever risk management reasons, they waited until right before trial to get it done. And with all of the kids, it's better late than never in terms of getting them some relief and some justice on this.
Well, you say the kids are getting relief and justice. I mean, how are they feeling about it? They're older now. They're all adults or practically adults. How are they feeling these days?
For so long, they have done everything they can just to keep themselves together. And when you get to the point, especially when you're up against the very start of a trial, and you're thinking about presenting horrific sexual abuse that they went through to a jury, and 12 people who are strangers to them, there's a lot of emotion that goes into that. And I know at the point that it finally settled, that it was really overwhelming for the kids. And so, it's their world is rattled right now, and they're trying to figure out, all right, how do we get on our feet and use this settlement to make things better in the future for all of us.
You might not be able to answer this question, but are these kids still in therapy, dealing with the trauma that they've experienced?
Yep. They're constantly working on their situation, therapy and consultations, and I mean, when you have sexual abuse like that at such an early age, and it goes untreated by DSHS, when you pick up the ball and start trying to run with it in your teens, you've got a lot of stuff that you're trying to cope with. And so, they're going to need guidance to make sure that they get the right support system in place, and help make a productive future for them.
And I'm assuming, I don't know if you know, but I'm assuming the kids at this point might not have much of a relationship with their biological parents. What do you know?
Well, they're still in contact with biological mom, who's spent a lifetime of her own trying to deal with abuse and neglect issues of her, that she's dealt with. And so they do a good job of staying in touch, and her, family outside of just the kids is there to try to help too. So their support systems in place, and we have a lot of optimism that will go well.
Now, you had mentioned you feel like DSHS is making strides. Again, it's now under DCYF. Do you feel like there are still any shortfalls on the state's part where they need to clean up their act?
Well, we certainly want to make sure that we're sharing information about people in foster homes who might pose a risk, I think that it's really important for caseworkers to get out of the office and get into these foster homes to make sure that they've got a good feel for what the dynamics are in a home. And this case in particular points out one of the flaws that we've got to address, and that's if we know that children are sexually abused at 2, 3, 4, 5, that you have to go in with some intensive level of therapy so that those kids don't cycle into their own violence and their own offenses. And this boy who is the older foster kid here, I mean, he's a great example. He's not a bad human being. And in the lawsuit, he admitted the abuses that he experienced. And he actually said at one point, I wish someone would have been there for me so that I didn't do this to them. And that's the biggest takeaway is get in there and provide the therapy that these kids know so that they can erect the barriers. That's probably a terrible word, so that they can put in place these safeguards to make sure that they don't become the offenders of the next generation.
Do we know how old the older boy was at the time?
He was 11, 12, as our kids were in that 3 to 4 to 5 range.
So too young himself to realize that he had fallen victim to this cycle. Now you said it. He even acknowledged that he could have used the therapy to help him avoid this.
Exactly right. And you're obviously running through your own hormonal issues at 12, 13, 14 years of age. And if you're not getting guidance about what's appropriate touch and interaction, then it's bound. It's so predictable to happen again.
So what's next, Daryl?
Constant vigilance. We've got to use history as our teacher, right? And so um, covering this lawsuit, for example, helps us get the message out to remind DSHS and DCYF that there are lessons to be learned and improvements to be made.
Very good. Attorney Daryl Cochran with the Fowl Cochran firm. Thank you so much for taking the time, Daryl. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Ryan.